Days before the shooting even started, Iran released a slick, AI-generated propaganda video showing its drones and hypersonic missiles supposedly sinking an American aircraft carrier beneath the waves of the Persian Gulf, produced with exactly the kind of high-end visual polish designed to circulate widely online. It was meant to be a warning, a message that any American warship sailing near Iranian waters was already as good as sunk before it even entered the Gulf. Then the actual war began, and within its opening 72 hours, Iran got the chance to prove that specific claim for real in front of the entire world watching. What happened next tells you almost everything you need to know about the gap between propaganda and reality in modern naval warfare today. Let's start with the warning itself, because Iran's leadership had been building toward this exact moment for weeks before the war even broke out in earnest. According to a post from Khamenei's own official account, dated February 17, 2026, Iran's supreme leader wrote directly and unambiguously that the Americans constantly say they've sent a warship toward Iran, and that a warship is a dangerous piece of military hardware, but more dangerous still than that warship is the weapon that can send that warship to the bottom of the sea. That statement came, according to reporting from the National Interest, even as U.S. and Iranian officials were simultaneously meeting in Geneva for a second round of nuclear talks that same week, meaning Iran was threatening to sink an American carrier with one hand while still sitting at the negotiating table with the other. Here's a hook worth sitting with right away. When a country's supreme leader personally threatens to sink an American warship while his own diplomats are still in the room negotiating with American counterparts, that's not really a message aimed at the negotiating table at all. That's a message aimed squarely at Iran's own domestic audience, and at every sailor serving aboard whichever carrier happened to be closest to the Persian Gulf at that exact moment. Let's talk about the specific weapons Iran actually claimed could back up that threat in real combat, because the arsenal itself is genuinely worth understanding in detail before going any further into this story. According to reporting from WANA, the West Asia news agency, Iran's naval doctrine has increasingly centered on what officials describe as a multi-layered missile envelope, built specifically to threaten warships operating near its coastline. That reporting details the Qadr 380, presented as a long-range naval cruise missile with a claimed range beyond 1,000 kilometers, incorporating advanced flight control systems said to be capable of adjusting altitude and trajectory mid-flight specifically to complicate any attempt at interception. That same reporting describes the Khalij Fars missile, Iran's first anti-ship ballistic missile, with an estimated range of 300 kilometers and a warhead weighing approximately 450 kilograms, reportedly using an independent guidance system during its terminal phase, specifically designed to lock onto a moving maritime target. Separate reporting from Interesting Engineering adds further detail to this arsenal, describing the Abu Mahdi cruise missile with a claimed range of 1,000 kilometers, alongside several hypersonic systems Tehran has reportedly developed specifically with American carriers in mind. That same reporting states Iran can also draw on swarms of small attack boats and suicide drones, weapons designed to overwhelm a carrier strike group's layered defenses, specifically through sheer volume and simultaneity, rather than any single weapon's individual sophistication. Let's talk about why that specific combination of weapons, small boats, and suicide drones layered alongside longer-range missiles represents such a genuinely difficult problem for any naval defense system to solve completely, regardless of how sophisticated that system happens to be. A carrier strike group's layered defenses are fundamentally built around prioritization, deciding in real time which incoming threats represent the greatest danger, and allocating limited interceptor missiles and defensive resources accordingly. A handful of expensive, sophisticated anti-ship ballistic missiles arriving alongside dozens of cheap, expendable drones and small boats forces exactly that kind of prioritization problem into overdrive, because every single incoming contact, however cheap or unsophisticated, still has to be tracked, assessed, and potentially engaged before it gets close enough to do damage. That's precisely the saturation logic Iran's naval doctrine appears to be built around, not necessarily finding one weapon capable of punching through every layer of defense on its own, but overwhelming the defensive system's capacity to sort real threats from decoys and low-value targets quickly enough to respond to everything simultaneously. That same Interesting Engineering reporting adds an important technical caveat worth taking seriously, though. Military analysts cited in that coverage suggest that while Iran's missiles themselves are genuinely improving in raw capability, the country's sensor and targeting networks remain considerably less advanced, not yet sophisticated enough to reliably track and hit a moving target, like an aircraft carrier at sea with real consistency. That reporting notes recent events had shown Iran capable of successfully hitting fixed targets, buildings, and military bases scattered across the Gulf region, but that a carrier group constantly changing course and speed, specifically to complicate exactly this kind of targeting problem, represents an entirely different and considerably harder challenge. The most likely outcome of any actual engagement, according to that same analysis, wouldn't be the dramatic sinking of a carrier itself, but rather a missile managing to damage a smaller, less heavily defended escort ship, or perhaps a nearby logistics vessel supporting the broader strike group. Here's a hook worth chewing on. An arsenal built around volume, speed, and unpredictable flight paths isn't designed to win a fair fight against a carrier strike group's defenses. It's designed to make that fight expensive and uncertain enough that an adversary starts questioning whether risking a carrier that close to Iranian shores is actually worth it in the first place. But here's where the expert analysis available before this war even started gets genuinely important, because it directly contradicts the confidence embedded in Iran's own propaganda. According to reporting from Forbes, geopolitical analyst Irina Tsukerman, president of the threat assessment firm Scarab Rising, put it plainly, stating that a U.S. supercarrier is built to take punishment and keep fighting, and that the Navy surrounds its carriers with layers of defense, including Aegis destroyers and cruisers, aircraft flying combat air patrol, electronic warfare support, decoys, and point defense systems. That same reporting notes another defense analyst, identified only as Farley, added that much modern anti-ship ordnance is actually designed with softer targets in mind, meaning most missiles available today, including many in Iran's own arsenal, were never really built with the expectation that they could destroy something as massive and heavily defended as a full-sized aircraft carrier. That same Forbes reporting includes a genuinely striking historical data point worth sitting with. The last United States Navy aircraft carrier actually sunk in combat was the Casablanca-class escort carrier USS Bismarck C, lost during the Battle of Iwo Jima after repeated Japanese kamikaze attacks, an event that had occurred at the time of that reporting, just over 81 years earlier. Modern aircraft carriers, according to that same coverage, are described as far larger and considerably more resilient than their World War II predecessors, a design philosophy built specifically around absorbing exactly the kind of saturation attack Iran's own doctrine seems built to attempt. Think about the engineering philosophy embedded in that historical comparison for a moment, because it explains why raw missile range and speed alone don't automatically translate into the ability to sink a modern carrier. A World War II-era escort carrier like the Bismarck C was a considerably smaller, more lightly constructed vessel than anything in the modern American fleet, built quickly and cheaply to support amphibious operations rather than designed from the ground up to survive sustained, repeated damage. Every carrier built since has incorporated decades of accumulated lessons about compartmentalization, damage control, redundant power and propulsion systems, and hull design specifically intended to keep a ship not just afloat, but genuinely combat capable, even after absorbing damage that would have doomed a lighter vessel entirely. That's precisely the kind of accumulated engineering advantage that raw missile statistics on a specification sheet simply don't capture. And it's exactly why military analysts remain so skeptical that any single weapon currently in Iran's declared arsenal could realistically replicate what would have been considered a devastating attack against a much older, much more vulnerable class of ship 8 decades ago. Here's a hook worth holding on to. 81 years without a single American aircraft carrier lost in combat isn't a coincidence or simple good fortune. That's the direct result of decades of deliberate engineering specifically focused on making a carrier survivable against exactly the kind of missile and drone saturation attacks that modern adversaries, including Iran, have spent years trying to develop as a countermeasure. Separate analysis, published by the National Interest, adds an important historical parallel worth remembering here too. That same reporting notes, it's worth remembering that the Ukrainian military successfully sank the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet flagship, the frigate Moskva, using a land-based anti-ship missile, proving that determined, well-executed anti-ship missile attacks absolutely can succeed against major warships under the right circumstances. But that same analysis draws a crucial distinction, suggesting the greater practical danger for the U.S. Navy in a scenario like this one might not be Iran directly targeting the most obvious, most heavily defended target, the carrier itself, but rather aiming for one of its more weakly defended escort vessels instead. Think about why that Moskva comparison, while genuinely instructive, doesn't actually translate as directly to an American carrier as it might initially seem. The Moskva was a Cold War-era cruiser, roughly a tenth the size of a modern American supercarrier. Without anything close to the same layered defensive escort screen, the combat air patrol, or the electronic warfare support that routinely surrounds a carrier strike group operating in a contested environment like the Persian Gulf. Russia's own naval doctrine, particularly around force protection for individual high-value vessels operating without a full accompanying strike group, left the Moskva considerably more exposed than an American carrier would ever realistically be allowed to operate. That's exactly why that same national interest analysis pivots toward warning about Iran targeting an escort vessel instead of the carrier itself, because an escort ship, however capable, simply doesn't benefit from anywhere near the same concentration of defensive resources that gets specifically allocated to protecting the carrier at the center of the formation. That same national interest reporting adds one more important piece of context worth including here. It notes that the U.S. Navy had already succeeded in countering drones and missiles during its own months-long standoff with the Tehran-backed Houthi movement, a real-world track record suggesting American naval defenses had already been tested against broadly similar saturation tactics well before this specific war against Iran ever began, and had, by that point, demonstrated a meaningful ability to handle exactly that kind of threat successfully. Now let's fast forward to the moment this entire theoretical debate actually got tested in real combat conditions, because it happened remarkably fast once the shooting started. According to reporting from Anadolu Agency, the U.S.-Israeli joint operation against Iran launched on a Saturday, and by its second day, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a dramatic public claim. According to that same reporting, the IRGC stated it had targeted the USS Abraham Lincoln with 4 ballistic missiles, declaring that its strikes against U.S. forces had entered a new phase, and that, in the Guard's own words, land and sea will become more and more the graveyard of terrorist aggressors. Let's look at the exact language Iran's military used here, because it matters. According to reporting from the Express, the IRGC statement, carried by Iranian state media and described as part of a broader campaign dubbed Operation True Promise 4, read plainly that the U.S. aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln was struck by 4 ballistic missiles. That same reporting states the Guard added that land and sea will increasingly become the graveyard of the terrorist aggressors, language clearly built for maximum domestic impact rather than technical precision. Here's a hook worth sitting with. Within 48 hours of the war beginning, Iran had already moved from threatening, in the abstract, to sink an American carrier, to publicly claiming it had actually done exactly that. That's an extraordinarily fast jump from deterrent rhetoric to a specific, falsifiable battlefield claim. And falsifiable claims carry real risk if they turn out not to be true. And this specific claim turned out not to be true almost immediately, contradicted within hours by the very military it was supposedly targeting. According to reporting from Naval Today, the United States Central Command flatly rejected the IRGC's assertion, describing it as false. CENTCOM's public statement on social media was direct and unambiguous. The Lincoln was not hit. The missiles launched didn't even come close. That same reporting states CENTCOM specifically stressed the Lincoln remained fully unaffected and continued normal flight operations throughout the entire incident. Let's look at CENTCOM's full public statement in detail, because the specific wording tells you a lot about how deliberately American officials structured this rebuttal. According to reporting from the Center Square, CENTCOM's post read that Iran's IRGC claims to have struck USS Abraham Lincoln with ballistic missiles, followed by a single blunt word, lie. The statement continued that the Lincoln was not hit, that the missiles launched didn't even come close, and that the Lincoln continued to launch aircraft in support of CENTCOM's relentless campaign to defend the American people by eliminating threats from the Iranian regime. Here's a hook worth carrying forward. There's a considerable difference between a military spokesperson issuing a carefully hedged denial and a military spokesperson posting the single word lie in capital letters on a public account. CENTCOM chose the second option, and that specific word choice tells you Washington wanted this rebuttal to be as unambiguous and as quotable as possible, specifically to prevent Iran's claim from gaining any credibility in the following news cycle. Let's talk about exactly why Iran's claim was considered so technically implausible in the first place, because the explanation reveals a genuinely fascinating amount of detail about how modern naval detection actually works behind the scenes, well beyond what most casual observers of this war would ever think to ask about. According to detailed analysis from the Lexington Institute, the United States Space Force detects the heat signature from the launch of any Iranian ballistic missile almost immediately, a detection that begins the entire process of determining missile type and trajectory, and passing that targeting data along in order to form an interception track. That same analysis notes the launch in question was also likely independently spotted by the Lincoln's own onboard E-2D Hawkeye radar aircraft, a dedicated airborne early warning platform specifically designed to track exactly this kind of incoming threat from a safe distance. That same Lexington Institute reporting details the broader defensive picture surrounding the carrier at that moment. Carrier Air Wing 9, embarked aboard the Lincoln, consisted of 8 separate squadrons, including F-35C stealth fighters, F-A-18E and F Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, the E-2D Hawkeyes themselves, CMV-22B Osprey transport aircraft, and MH-60R and SC Hawk helicopters. That reporting specifically notes that while few people tend to sing the praises of the Navy's carrier-based radar plane compared to its flashier fighter jets, the Hawkeye's mission is genuinely critical to exactly this kind of scenario, providing early, reliable detection long before any incoming missile could realistically threaten the carrier itself. Think about what an air wing composed of 8 distinct specialized squadrons actually represents in terms of defensive depth. This isn't a single ship relying on its own onboard systems alone. It's an integrated, mobile air force capable of stealth strike missions through the F-35Cs, conventional strike and fighter coverage through the Super Hornets, dedicated jamming and electronic warfare disruption through the Growlers, persistent airborne radar coverage through the Hawkeyes, rapid logistics and personnel transport through the Ospreys, and both combat and rescue helicopter support through the Seahawks. Every one of those aircraft types plays a specific role in the broader detection and defense picture surrounding a carrier, which means any incoming missile threat isn't simply being assessed by the ship's own radar and point defense systems. It's being tracked by an entire airborne ecosystem specifically built to identify and respond to exactly this kind of attack, well before it ever gets close enough to matter. Here's a hook worth chewing on. The most important aircraft protecting an American carrier during an incident like this one isn't necessarily the fighter jet capable of shooting something down. It's the far less glamorous radar plane that spots the threat early enough for every other layer of defense to actually have time to respond. Let's talk about the broader operational context surrounding the specific claim too, because it wasn't happening in isolation. According to that same Lexington Institute analysis, American forces conducted more than 900 strikes within just the first 24 hours of this war alone. An operational tempo that puts the scale of this entire opening phase into perspective. Against that backdrop, a single unverified Iranian claim about striking one American carrier represents an almost desperate attempt to generate a comparably dramatic headline of its own, something capable of competing, at least in the news cycle, with the sheer overwhelming scale of the American and Israeli campaign already underway. Think about the sheer disparity in scale represented by that comparison for a moment. 900 strikes in 24 hours. Spread across an entire country's worth of military infrastructure against a single unverified claim about 4 missiles fired at one specific ship. That's not a contest between 2 comparably matched military campaigns. That's a massive, sustained American and Israeli operation running at an overwhelming operational tempo against which Iran's own military response, at least in this specific opening exchange, appears to have consisted largely of a single dramatic but ultimately unverifiable claim, launched specifically because it was one of the only genuinely headline-worthy counter-narratives available to Tehran at that particular moment. Now here's the detail that gives this entire story its genuinely ironic twist. Because while Iran's claim about hitting an American carrier turned out to be completely false, something involving an actual carrier really did get struck that same day, just not the one Iran was claiming. According to that same Naval Today reporting, the clarification from CENTCOM followed U.S. strikes on an Iranian naval vessel called the Shahid Bagheri, a ship specifically used for Iranian drone operations. CENTCOM's own social media response drove this exact contrast home directly, stating plainly that the Iranian regime's false messaging machine continued to falsely claim it had sunk a U.S. aircraft carrier, adding the actual truth that the only carrier that had been hit was the Shahid Bagheri, an Iranian drone carrier, struck by U.S. forces within hours of the broader operation launching. Think about the sheer irony embedded in that specific exchange for a moment. Iran commissioned the Shahid Bagheri as its first drone carrier just 1 month before this war began, according to that same Naval Today reporting, designed specifically as a mobile platform capable of intelligence gathering, missile strikes, and aerial surveillance. Iran built and proudly unveiled its own version of exactly the kind of asymmetric naval capability it hoped might eventually threaten American carriers. And within the opening hours of this specific war, that same vessel became the actual carrier that got struck, while Iran's claim about striking an American carrier turned out to be entirely fabricated. Let's sit with the timeline of that specific vessel's existence for a moment, because it makes the irony even sharper. A ship commissioned with genuine national fanfare just weeks earlier, presented as a symbol of Iran's growing naval sophistication and its ability to project exactly the kind of asymmetric threat this entire video has spent so much time discussing, ended up being struck and disabled within the opening hours of the very war it was supposedly built to help fight. That's not simply an embarrassing coincidence. It's a genuinely revealing data point about the actual balance of naval capability between these two countries at this specific moment in the conflict. One side's brand new flagship asymmetric platform neutralized almost immediately, while the other side's flagship carrier continued launching aircraft entirely unaffected by whatever missiles Iran claims to have fired at it. Here's a hook worth sitting with. Iran spent years building and rhetorically threatening America's carriers with sophisticated new missiles. In the opening days of the actual war, the only carrier that genuinely got hit was Iran's own. There's also a broader lesson about propaganda risk buried in this specific sequence of events, one worth naming directly. When a government issues a dramatic, falsifiable military claim during an active war, it's making a calculated bet that either the claim will hold up under scrutiny, or that the opposing side won't bother mounting a fast, forceful public rebuttal. CENTCOM's response in this specific case demonstrates exactly what happens when that bet fails on both counts simultaneously. Not only did American officials possess enough real-time tracking and detection capability to immediately and confidently know the claim was false, they also had the communications infrastructure and institutional willingness to broadcast that rebuttal within the very same news cycle, denying Iran's claim any real window of unchallenged circulation before the true story became public. Let's also acknowledge the real, serious cost this specific opening phase of the war did produce, because it's important not to let the false carrier claim overshadow the genuine casualties that were happening simultaneously elsewhere in the region during this exact same window of time. According to reporting from the Center Square, CENTCOM confirmed that 3 American service members had been killed in action during Iranian strikes as part of this broader operation, with 5 more seriously wounded, and additional personnel sustaining shrapnel injuries and concussions. Those casualties, according to that same reporting, marked the first American deaths of this entire war, and they occurred amid Iranian retaliatory strikes against Gulf nations hosting American bases and troops, specifically including the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Think about how that context reframes the entire carrier claim controversy. Iran's fabricated story about sinking, or at least striking, an American aircraft carrier wasn't simply harmless propaganda floating in a news vacuum. It was published at the exact same moment American service members were genuinely dying in strikes elsewhere across the region. That's precisely why CENTCOM's blunt, immediate rebuttal mattered so much strategically. Allowing a false, dramatic claim about a carrier strike to circulate unchallenged, even briefly, risked overshadowing or distorting the public understanding of where the real, verified casualties in this war were actually occurring. Let's talk about how seriously this specific false claim was still taken by outside military analysts, though, because even a debunked claim can carry genuine strategic weight worth understanding in its own right, separate entirely from whether the underlying facts actually held up. According to a detailed assessment from Defense Security Asia, the IRGC's statement used language that intentionally amplified offensive credibility and domestic resilience messaging, landing at a moment when Iran's entire political hierarchy was reeling from the reported death of Khamenei himself just 1 day earlier. That same analysis notes CENTCOM's rebuttal simultaneously signaled operational survivability and a clear refusal to concede any narrative dominance in an extraordinarily fast-moving strategic confrontation. Crucially, that same reporting states that whether Iran's missiles were launched and failed, were intercepted, or were never actually fired at genuine maritime coordinates in the first place, remains, even in hindsight, not fully independently verified, though the claim alone still forced a real reassessment of regional missile defense networks, maritime tracking intelligence, and the broader escalation management mechanisms embedded within American and Iranian conflict doctrine going forward. Here's a hook worth carrying into the final stretch of this story. Even a claim that turns out to be false still does real strategic work, forcing military planners on both sides to seriously reassess exactly what their opponent might actually be capable of the next time, regardless of whether this particular attempt genuinely succeeded. Let's talk about how Iran's naval ambitions against American carriers have continued evolving since that specific opening exchange, because the story didn't simply end with CENTCOM's rebuttal. According to reporting from Patriot TV, citing Reuters sourcing from 6 separate people familiar with the matter, Iran has been working to finalize a deal with China to purchase advanced anti-ship cruise missiles known as the CM-302, weapons American vessels reportedly have no effective defense against. That same reporting states this potential arms deal was unfolding during a subsequent ceasefire period, with Iran reportedly using that pause in fighting to feverishly rearm rather than simply stand down. Think about what it means, strategically, for Iran to be pursuing exactly this kind of foreign weapons acquisition, specifically during a ceasefire period rather than during active combat. A ceasefire typically provides the kind of breathing room a country needs to rebuild, resupply, and reassess its military posture without the immediate pressure of ongoing strikes disrupting that process. Using that specific window to pursue a sophisticated new anti-ship weapons deal suggests Iran's leadership drew a clear lesson from the failed carrier claim covered throughout this entire video, that its existing arsenal genuinely wasn't sufficient to credibly threaten an American carrier, and that closing that capability gap required looking outside its own domestic weapons industry toward a more advanced foreign supplier instead. That same Patriot TV reporting adds important additional context about the broader diplomatic backdrop surrounding this specific arms deal. It notes President Trump had repeatedly stated he would not end the naval blockade of Iran until a permanent deal to end the war was reached. While Iran's own supreme leader at the time, Mojtaba Khamenei, was simultaneously pledging to relentlessly protect the country's nuclear and missile capabilities, and separately claiming that Tehran's new management of the Strait of Hormuz would bring calm and progress to the region. That's a genuinely striking combination of messages. A leadership simultaneously promising regional stability while reportedly working behind the scenes to acquire exactly the kind of advanced weaponry that would make any future confrontation with American naval forces considerably more dangerous than the failed attempt covered throughout most of this video. Think about what that specific timeline tells you about how seriously to weigh Iran's original failed carrier claim against its longer-term strategic intentions. The March attempt to strike, or at least to convincingly claim credit for striking, an American carrier failed completely and was publicly debunked within hours. But rather than abandoning that broader ambition afterward, the available reporting suggests Iran instead turned toward acquiring more sophisticated foreign-supplied weapon systems, specifically capable of closing the exact gap that caused the original attempt to fail so badly. That's not the behavior of a country that's given up on the underlying goal. That's the behavior of a country treating its first failed attempt as a lesson to learn from, rather than a reason to abandon the broader strategy altogether. Let's pull this all together now, because I think the full arc of this story tells you something genuinely important about how information itself functions as a weapon in modern warfare, separate entirely from whether any individual claim turns out to be true or false in the end. Iran built years of anti-ship missile development, a dedicated drone carrier, and an entire public deterrence doctrine specifically around the threat of sinking or crippling an American aircraft carrier. When the actual war began, and Iran got its first real opportunity to test that doctrine, the result was a fabricated claim, debunked within hours by a blunt one-word rebuttal from CENTCOM, while the only carrier genuinely struck in that specific exchange turned out to be Iran's own. And yet, months later, rather than abandoning that ambition, Iran was reportedly working to acquire more advanced foreign weapons, specifically designed to make good on that same original threat the next time an opportunity arose. What do you think this tells you about how seriously to take Iran's ongoing rhetoric about American naval vulnerability going forward? Do you think the gap between Iran's stated ambitions and its actual demonstrated capability, at least so far, means American carriers can continue operating near Iranian waters with reasonable confidence? Or do you think the combination of persistent Iranian development efforts and increasingly sophisticated foreign weapons acquisitions eventually closes that gap in a way that finally makes this kind of threat genuinely credible? Let me know where you land on this, because based on everything covered here, this specific question, whether Iran can actually back up its own rhetoric, sits at the very center of how the naval dimension of this entire war continues to unfold in the months ahead. One final thought before wrapping this up. Propaganda doesn't need to be true to be effective, and it doesn't need to succeed to be worth attempting, at least from the perspective of the government issuing it. Iran's claim about striking the USS Abraham Lincoln was completely false, debunked within hours, and undercut by the embarrassing irony of its own drone carrier being the only vessel that actually got hit that day. But the claim still generated headlines, still forced American officials to spend time and public messaging resources on an immediate, forceful rebuttal, and still projected a message of resilience and resolve to Iran's own domestic audience at a moment of genuine political crisis following Khamenei's reported death. Sometimes the actual battle isn't fought entirely with missiles and radar. Sometimes it's fought just as much in the 15 minutes between a dramatic claim going out and a military spokesperson typing back a single, blunt word in response, and understanding that second, quieter battle is just as important as understanding the missiles themselves.